This photograph dates back to 1871 and was taken at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. The girl in the picture is Catherine Doyle, a mere 9 years old. But really look at this image. Focus on her eyes. Notice the unnatural stiffness of her posture, the expression that simply does not belong on a child's face. Catherine Doyle challenged everything that Victorian-era doctors thought they knew about the human mind. Her case remains unexplainable even today, more than a century and a half later. This photograph captures one of the most unsettling and haunting medical mysteries of the 19th century. What happened to Catherine Doyle defies explanation by modern medicine and psychology, and perhaps it will never truly be understood. But the story you're about to hear goes far beyond any ordinary medical case. It's a story that makes you question the very limits of human reality. To truly understand Catherine Doyle's case, we need to go back to the world of 1871. America was still healing from the deep wounds of the Civil War, which had ended only 6 years prior. Boston was a city undergoing massive change, filled with Irish immigrants fleeing starvation and poverty in their homeland, all seeking a new life in the New World. Psychiatric medicine was in its infancy, and it was brutal. Asylums were dark, isolated places where people considered mentally disturbed were literally hidden away from society. There was no real understanding of mental illness, psychological disorders, or child development. Anything that didn't fit social norms was simply locked away and forgotten. The Danvers State Hospital, where Catherine would spend her final years, was one of these sinister institutions, built on land that had once been Salem farms. It bore not only the stigma of primitive medicine, but also the dark echoes of American history itself. The corridors of that place had witnessed treatments that we would consider torture today. Prolonged ice-cold baths, extreme physical restraints, sensory deprivation, and highly questionable medical experiments. It was in this oppressive and scientifically limited environment that Catherine Doyle would become one of the most documented and disturbing cases in 19th century psychiatry. And it's important to understand that the doctors of the time, however well-intentioned they might have been, simply didn't have the conceptual or technological tools to understand what they were seeing. Catherine Doyle was born on March 15, 1862, in the heart of Boston. She was the daughter of Patrick and Mary Doyle, two Irish immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life. Patrick worked as a longshoreman at Boston's bustling port, loading and unloading ships that brought goods from all over the world. Apartment in the North End, a predominantly Irish neighborhood where living conditions were tough, but the community was united by their Catholic faith and the shared experience of immigration. Catherine grew up surrounded by the sounds of Irish spoken by older neighbors, the aroma of homemade bread from local bakeries, and the folk tales her maternal grandmother told about the old country. By all accounts found in family archives and parish records, Catherine was an absolutely normal child during her first 7 years. She was playful, curious, and intelligent for her age, but within the expected range for a girl of her social background and the time period. She played with rag dolls her mother made, helped with simple chores around the house, and attended Sunday Mass at St. Leonard's Church, where she learned basic prayers in Latin. The parochial school teachers who taught Catherine described her as a dedicated student, though not exceptionally brilliant. She learned to read and write at a normal pace, showed an interest in Bible stories, and got along well with the other children. There was absolutely nothing in her behavior, development, or personality that hinted at the extraordinary events that would come. Mary Doyle, in later interviews with doctors, always emphasized that Catherine was her sweet girl, a loving child who enjoyed helping her mother in the kitchen and worried when her father came home late from work. Patrick described his daughter as the light of our house, a child who brought joy and normalcy to a life that was otherwise marked by the harsh realities of urban poverty. Then in September 1869, everything changed so dramatically and suddenly that to this day, doctors and researchers still debate what really happened to Catherine Doyle in that fateful month. On the morning of September 14th, 1869, a Tuesday that Mary Doyle would forever remember as the day she lost her daughter, Catherine woke up different. Not physically. She looked the same as always, with the same round, freckled face, the same curly brown hair, and the same small stature of a 7-year-old girl. But something fundamental had shifted overnight, something that went far beyond physical appearance. The first signs were subtle. Catherine woke up later than usual, which was unusual for a child who had always been a natural early riser. When she finally came downstairs for breakfast, she moved differently, more deliberately, more calculated, as if each step was carefully planned out. Even more disturbing, she didn't greet her parents with the usual "Good morning, Mommy," and "Good morning, Daddy," which was a routine in their family. Instead, Catherine simply sat at the table and stared intently at her parents with an expression that Mary would later describe as empty, but at the same time very, very old. When Mary asked if she was feeling all right, Catherine answered, but her voice had changed. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. It had a rougher, more mature quality, as if it belonged to someone much older. In the weeks that followed, Catherine's transformation became impossible to ignore. She began displaying knowledge that a child of her age and social background simply couldn't possess. During family meals, she made casual comments about historical events with impressive accuracy. She spoke about the American Revolutionary War as if she had personally witnessed it, mentioning specific details about battles that weren't taught in the basic parochial school she attended. Even more disconcerting, Catherine began demonstrating a familiarity with ancient Greek philosophy. She quoted Aristotle and Plato, not like a child who had memorized phrases, but like someone who genuinely understood complex philosophical concepts. When Patrick, confused, asked where she had learned these things, Catherine just smiled, a smile her parents were starting to fear, and replied that she had always known these things. Catherine's religious knowledge also expanded inexplicably. She began reciting complete passages from the Bible in Latin, not just the simple prayers she had learned in church, but obscure passages from the Old Testament that most priests needed to consult books to recall. When Father O'Brien from St. Leonard's Church tested her knowledge, he was shocked to discover that Catherine could discuss complex theology with the depth of an advanced seminarian. But perhaps the most disturbing of all was the knowledge Catherine demonstrated about the people around her. She knew intimate secrets about neighbors and family acquaintances, information that no one had shared with her. She casually mentioned marital problems between neighborhood couples, secret financial debts, and even moral indiscretions that supposedly no one knew about. While Catherine's impossible knowledge was already disturbing enough, it soon became clear that her transformation had much darker aspects. She began showing a morbid interest in death and suffering that was completely foreign to the sweet personality she had displayed during her first 7 years. Catherine began asking detailed questions about how people died, not the natural curiosity of a child about mortality, but specific and technical questions about execution methods, medieval torture, and fatal diseases. She described with frightening precision the torture practices of the Spanish Inquisition, assassination methods from ancient cultures, and even Egyptian mummification techniques. Most alarming was that Catherine seemed to take pleasure in these descriptions. Her eyes would light up when she spoke about suffering, and she would smile in a way that sent chills down the spines of the adults around her. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child, but something calculated, almost sadistic. Catherine also developed a disturbing relationship with physical pain. She began deliberately hurting herself, scratching herself with her own nails until she bled, biting her lips until they were raw, and hitting her head against walls hard enough to leave marks. But the most frightening thing was that she showed no distress during these episodes of self-mutilation. On the contrary, she seemed to be in a state of ecstasy, as if physical pain brought her some kind of incomprehensible pleasure. Mary Doyle tried several times to stop these behaviors, but Catherine always found ways to continue hurting herself. She used seemingly harmless objects, loose nails in the walls, pieces of broken glass, even kitchen utensils, to cut and scratch herself. And when questioned about why she did this, she simply replied that she felt like it, or that something asked her to do it. Catherine's behavior toward animals also changed drastically. Before, she had been gentle with the stray cats that roamed the neighborhood and with a neighbor's dog. After the transformation, animals began actively avoiding her. Dogs would bark when she approached, cats would run away, and even birds seemed to avoid flying near her. When Mary asked why the animals acted so strangely, Catherine replied with that cold smile she had developed. "They know what I am now, Mommy. They're smarter than you." As the months passed, Catherine's case evolved beyond behavioral and intellectual changes. She began demonstrating physical capabilities that simply shouldn't have been possible for a child of her age and physical build. The first notable manifestation was her disproportionate strength. Catherine, who had always been a small and physically normal girl, suddenly could break objects with surprising ease. During a fit of rage in December 1869, she snapped a solid oak chair in half using only her hands. Patrick, who worked with heavy wood at the port every day, examined the broken chair and was perplexed. The wood had been broken in a way that would require considerable force, far beyond what any child could generate. On another occasion, Catherine left impressions of her fingers permanently engraved in the family's wooden kitchen table. Not superficial scratches, but deep marks as if her small fingers had the hardness and pressure of metal tools. Mary tried to sand the marks away, but they were too deep, remaining as a disturbing reminder of her daughter's inexplicable strength. Catherine also began demonstrating abnormal physical endurance. She could stay in uncomfortable positions for hours without showing fatigue or discomfort. Once, Mary found her standing in the center of the living room at 2 o'clock in the morning, completely motionless, staring intently at the wall. When questioned, Catherine said she had been in that position since dinner, more than 6 hours, without moving once. Catherine's resistance to cold was particularly impressive. During Boston's harsh winter of 1869 to 1870, she frequently went outside, wearing much less clothing than the weather required, seemingly unaffected by temperatures that made other neighborhood residents shiver. On one memorable occasion, Patrick found her sleeping in the snow-covered backyard, wearing only her nightgown, showing no signs of hypothermia or discomfort. But perhaps the most disturbing physical manifestation was the change in Catherine's eyes. Several neighbors and family acquaintances began commenting that there was something wrong with her gaze. They described her eyes as having a hypnotic, almost predatory quality. People who looked directly at Catherine for extended periods reported feeling dizzy, experiencing headaches, and having an inexplicable sensation of fear. Mary noticed that Catherine's eyes sometimes seemed to change color depending on the light or her mood. Normally brown, they sometimes appeared almost black, particularly during her most disturbing episodes. On some occasions, Mary swore she could see other shapes moving in the depths of Catherine's pupils, as if something else was looking through her daughter's eyes. As Catherine's behavior became increasingly disturbing and inexplicable, Patrick and Mary Doyle did what any desperate parents would do. They sought help everywhere they could. As devout Catholics, their first recourse was the church. Father Timothy O'Brien of St. Leonard's Church had known Catherine since she was born. He had baptized her, overseen her first communion, and had always considered her one of the sweetest children in his parish. When the Doyles sought his help, he initially hesitated to believe the stories they told. Surely, he thought, it was just a difficult phase that many children go through, exaggerated by the worried imaginations of loving parents. This perspective quickly changed when Father O'Brien met with Catherine personally. During a pastoral visit to the Doyles' house in January 1870, he tried to talk with the girl about simple religious matters. To his shock, Catherine not only demonstrated extraordinary theological knowledge, but also began questioning fundamental aspects of Catholic doctrine with sophisticated arguments he rarely heard even from advanced seminarians. Even more disturbing, Catherine showed knowledge of intimate details about the priest's personal life that he had never shared with anyone. She mentioned sins from his past, doubts about his faith that he kept secret, and even specific events from his childhood in a small Irish town. When the priest, shaken, asked how she knew these things, Catherine just smiled and replied that she knew many things about many people, convinced that he was dealing with something beyond ordinary medical understanding. Father O'Brien decided to perform an exorcism. The ritual was conducted at the Doyle's house on a February evening in 1870, with only the family and an elderly deacon present. What happened during this ceremony was so disturbing that Father O'Brien never spoke publicly about it, mentioning it only in his personal diaries, discovered decades later that it was the most terrifying experience of my entire priestly life. During the exorcism, Catherine didn't react as religious manuals suggested a possessed person should. She showed no agony, didn't writhe, didn't scream or blaspheme. Instead, she laughed aloud, echoing laugh that seemed to come from multiple voices simultaneously. And then, to the priest's absolute horror, she began reciting the exorcism ritual along with him, word for word, in perfect Latin, anticipating each line before he even pronounced it. After the failed exorcism, the Doyles turned to medicine, hoping that science could offer explanations that religion had failed to provide. They sought out Dr. Henry Morrison, one of the few Boston doctors who specialized in mental disorders and had studied in Europe, where more advanced psychiatric techniques were being developed. Dr. Morrison was a meticulous man known for his rigorous scientific approach and detailed documentation of clinical cases. When the Doyles sought his help, he initially approached Catherine's case with healthy professional skepticism, assuming he was dealing with an exceptionally intelligent child who might be suffering from some kind of psychological trauma. This perspective changed dramatically during his first sessions with Catherine. The doctor conducted examinations over 2 intensive weeks in February and March 1870, meticulously documenting every aspect of the girl's behavior and capabilities. His reports, which survive to this day in Boston's historical medical archives, make truly disturbing reading. Morrison immediately noted that Catherine demonstrated intelligence far superior to average, but directed almost exclusively toward morbid and disturbing subjects. She could discuss human anatomy with a precision rivaling that of medical students, describe rare diseases with exact symptomatology, and even suggest medical treatments that were at the forefront of medicine at the time. During sessions, Catherine constantly drew and wrote, but her artistic creations weren't the flowers, houses, or animals typical of children her age. Instead, she produced detailed images of anatomically correct human skeletons, scenes of death and decomposition, and human figures in positions of extreme agony. Her drawings were technically proficient in a way that shouldn't have been possible for a child without formal artistic training. Dr. Morrison was particularly intrigued by Catherine's writings. She wrote fluently in several languages she had never studied, including Latin, ancient Greek, and even rudimentary Egyptian hieroglyphs. Morrison most were Catherine's eyes. In his reports, he wrote extensively about the inexplicable sensation he had when looking directly at her. He described the experience as deeply unsettling, comparing it to the feeling of being analyzed by an intelligence much older and more experienced than should exist in such a young mind. The doctor also documented several physical anomalies during his examinations. Catherine's body temperature was consistently lower than normal, but she showed no signs of hypothermia. Her pulse was abnormally slow but regular. More strangely, plants in his office began to wither when Catherine was present for extended periods, even when all other environmental conditions remained constant. The event that finally led to Catherine's admission to Danvers Hospital happened on a particularly cold February night in 1870. It was an incident so bizarre and inexplicable that it convinced even the most skeptical that Catherine needed immediate, specialized medical care. Patrick Doyle woke up at 3 a.m. with a strange feeling that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, and he noticed the air seemed particularly cold, even considering it was the height of a Boston winter. He got up to check on the family and discovered that Catherine wasn't in her bed. After searching the entire house without finding her, Patrick looked out the kitchen window and saw a small figure standing in the snow-covered backyard. Catherine was in the center of the yard, completely motionless, wearing only her thin white cotton nightgown. She was in the middle of a snowstorm that had begun during the night, and her body was already partially covered with snow. What shocked Patrick most was Catherine's position. She was standing with her arms extended toward the sky, as if embracing the storm. Her head was tilted back, looking directly at the night sky, and she remained completely still despite the strong winds and heavy snow. Patrick ran outside, expecting to find his daughter suffering from severe hypothermia or worse. But when he reached her, he was shocked to discover that, despite having been in the storm for several hours, Catherine wasn't shivering or showing any signs of discomfort from the cold. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, but she was breathing normally and seemed completely conscious. When Patrick tried to bring her inside, Catherine slowly turned to look at him. What he saw at that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Catherine's eyes were completely black, not just dilated pupils, but completely black, as if there were no visible iris or white. And when she spoke, her voice echoed in a way that seemed to come not just from her throat, but from the very air around her. She looked directly at Patrick with those impossible black eyes and said words he would repeat to doctors for the rest of his life. The stars are almost aligned, Father, and when they meet in the correct position, you'll finally understand that Catherine never really existed. She was just preparation for something much more important. The morning after the maid, Catherine would be admitted to Danvers State Hospital. The decision wasn't taken lightly. Everyone involved recognized that they were dealing with something beyond their comprehension. Father O'Brien admitted that his spiritual resources had proven inadequate. Dr. Morrison confessed that he had never seen a similar case and needed the infrastructure and resources of a specialized institution to have any hope of understanding Catherine's condition. For Patrick and Mary, surrendering their only daughter to medical authorities was a decision that devastated them emotionally. But they recognized that Catherine represented a danger not only to herself, but potentially to others. Her displays of supernatural strength, impossible knowledge, and increasingly disturbing behaviors created an unsustainable situation. Danvers Hospital was chosen because it was considered one of New England's most advanced institutions for treating mental disorders. Under the direction of Dr. Elias Hartwell, the hospital had implemented some of the most modern techniques of European psychiatry and had resources for extensive medical documentation. On the morning of March 15, 1870, exactly 1 year after her 8th birthday, Catherine was taken from her Boston home to Danvers Hospital. She cooperated fully with the process, demonstrating a strange understanding of the situation that was far beyond her apparent age. During the carriage ride to Danvers, Catherine remained silent most of the time, looking out the window with that ancient expression that had become her defining trait. Only once did she speak, turning to Dr. Morrison, who was accompanying her, and say, "You're going to try to photograph me, aren't you, doctor? It will be interesting to see what your camera can capture." Danvers State Hospital was an imposing and foreboding institution built in the Gothic Revival style that dominated institutional architecture of the era. Erected on hills offering a panoramic view of the Massachusetts countryside, the main building stretched for more than half a mile, with its pointed towers and arched windows, creating a silhouette more reminiscent of a medieval castle than a modern hospital. The institution had been built following the principles of so-called moral treatment, a psychiatric philosophy that promised to cure patients through structured routines, therapeutic work, and a controlled environment. In theory, it was a revolutionary and humane approach to treating mental illness. In practice, Danvers Hospital had become a repository for people society considered incurable or too dangerous to live freely. When Catherine arrived in March 1870, the hospital housed more than 600 Patients in conditions we would consider appalling today. The long, dark corridors constantly echoed with disturbing sounds. Screams from patients in crisis, the metallic clang of keys and chains, and the constant murmur of incoherent conversations. A strong disinfectant smell tried unsuccessfully to mask the odor of urine, sweat, and human despair. The institution's chief physician, Dr. Elias Hartwell, was a 52-year-old man who had dedicated his life to studying mental disorders. A graduate of Harvard University and having briefly studied in Paris with some of the pioneers of European psychiatry, Hartwell considered himself a progressive scientist, determined to apply rigorous observation and documentation methods to advance medical knowledge about the human mind. When Catherine was brought to his office for the mandatory initial examination, Hartwell expected to find another case of childhood hysteria or perhaps some kind of developmental disorder. He had read Dr. Morrison's reports, but maintained healthy professional skepticism about the more extraordinary claims contained in those documents. This perspective changed drastically in the first minutes of his interaction with Catherine. When she entered his office, accompanied by a nurse, and still wearing the simple dress she had worn on the trip for Boston, she didn't show the anxiety, confusion, or fear typical of new patients, especially children. Instead, she examined the office with calculating eyes, as if evaluating not just the environment but Dr. Hartwell himself. Before Hartwell could even begin his routine examination, Catherine surprised him by mentioning specific details about 3 patients who had recently died at the hospital. She knew their full names, exact dates of death, and, most disturbingly, intimate details about the circumstances that had led to their deaths. Information contained only in confidential medical files to which she couldn't have had access. Even more shocking, Catherine showed knowledge of personal secrets about Dr. Hartwell himself that he had never shared with anyone. She mentioned specific events from his childhood, controversial professional decisions he had made, and even aspects of his marital life that had caused problems in his marriage. When Hartwell, visibly shaken, asked how she could know these things, Catherine simply smiled with that cold smile that had become her trademark and replied that she had ways of knowing things about interesting people. Initially, Catherine was placed in the hospital's pediatric ward, a relatively small section that housed around 20 children suffering from various mental disorders. The ward was under the supervision of Sister Margaret O'Connell, an Irish nun who had worked with disturbed children for over 15 years and considered herself highly experienced in handling difficult cases. Catherine's presence in the pediatric ward quickly turned out to be problematic, although not for the reasons the medical staff initially expected. Catherine wasn't violent with the other children, didn't cause any obvious disruptions, and generally obeyed the institution's basic rules. The problem was more subtle and, in many ways, more disturbing than overt aggressive behavior. Catherine exerted a strange and inexplicable influence over the other children in the ward. Within a week of her arrival, 3 children who had previously been considered relatively stable cases began exhibiting completely new and unsettling behaviors. They stopped participating in their usual recreational activities, stopped responding normally to questions from the medical staff, and spent hours sitting silently, staring fixedly at specific spots on the walls, as if they were seeing something adults couldn't perceive. A 6-year-old girl named Emma Sullivan, who had been admitted due to recurring night terrors following the traumatic death of her parents in a carriage accident, began talking obsessively about a shadowy figure she insisted was always present in the ward. Emma described this entity with consistent and very specific details. A very tall woman dressed entirely in black with long, dark hair that seemed to move even when there was no wind, and eyes she described as dark holes where there should be light. Most disturbingly, all the children who began exhibiting these strange behaviors described the exact same figure, same height, same appearance, same specific details about clothing and physical characteristics, as if they were all seeing precisely the same thing, something invisible to the adults, but perfectly real to them. Sister Margaret initially tried to dismiss these visions as a case of collective hysteria or exaggerated childhood imagination. However, her concern grew when she realized these children also began demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. They spoke about events from Catherine's life before her admission, mentioned specific conversations she had had with her parents, and even described details about the Doyle family house in Boston, places none of them had ever visited. A 9-year-old boy named Timothy Chun, the son of Chinese immigrants who had been admitted due to episodes of selective mutism, suddenly began speaking fluently about Catherine's childhood in Ireland, including stories about relatives who had died before she was even born. How could Timothy know such intimate information about an Irish-American family? How could any of these children have access to these personal details? The situation became even more alarming when the children began acting in a coordinated manner, as if they were following invisible instructions. They moved through the ward corridors in specific formations, sat in particular geometric configurations during meals, and sometimes spoke in unison, reciting words in languages none of them had ever studied. Dr. Hartwell, observing these developments with growing concern, began to suspect that Catherine was somehow influencing the behavior of the other children through methods he couldn't understand or detect. His detailed observations documented behavioral patterns that defied conventional psychological explanations. After 6 weeks of careful observation, Dr. Hartwell made the difficult decision to transfer Catherine to an individual room in the hospital's isolation section. The decision wasn't motivated by any violent or disruptive behavior on her part, but rather by the inexplicable influence she exerted on the other children and the need to study her case in a more controlled environment. The isolation room designated for Catherine was located on the 3rd floor of the hospital's east wing, far away from the main activity areas. It was a Spartan cell, approximately 10 by 13 feet, containing only an iron bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden table, a simple chair, and a metal bucket for personal needs. A single, small window protected by iron bars provided limited natural light during the day. The transfer to isolation marked the beginning of a more intensive phase of observation and medical experimentation. Dr. Hartwell was determined to understand the nature of Catherine's condition and, if possible, document it in a way that could significantly contribute to scientific knowledge about rare mental disorders. Daily therapy sessions with Catherine quickly took on an unusual character. Instead of her responding passively to the doctor's questions like a typical patient, Catherine frequently took control of the conversations, directing them toward areas that made Dr. Hartwell deeply uncomfortable. She asked penetrating questions about his personal life, his professional motivations, his most intimate fears, and his deepest insecurities. Catherine demonstrated a disturbing ability to identify people's psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. During one particularly memorable session in May of 1870, she confronted Dr. Hartwell about a traumatic event from his childhood that he had never mentioned to anyone: the accidental drowning of a girl named Sarah Mitchell when they were both 12 years old. Catherine described the incident with details that exactly matched Hartwell's memories, including specific details about the weather that day, the exact words that were spoken, and even the feelings of guilt and cowardice that had haunted Hartwell ever since. Even more disturbing than Catherine's impossible knowledge was the way she used this information. She didn't simply reveal secrets. She employed them as precise psychological tools, probing and manipulating the emotions of the people around her. During her sessions with Hartwell, she managed to make him question not only his professional competence, but also his personal sanity. Dr. Hartwell began meticulously documenting other anomalous phenomena associated with Catherine's presence. The temperature in her room was consistently lower than the rest of the hospital, a difference of 7 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit that persisted even when the heating system was working perfectly and all other environmental conditions remained constant. Plants placed near her window would wither and die within days, regardless of the care they received. Even stranger, several members of the medical staff reported disturbing experiences when spending long periods of time near Catherine's room. Nurses reported experiencing severe headaches, inexplicable nausea, and vivid nightmares that began only after they started working in her section. 2 guards requested transfers to other areas of the hospital after reporting constant sensations of being watched, even when Catherine was clearly sleeping. During the summer and fall of 1870, Dr. Hartwell implemented an experimental study program with Catherine that went far beyond the standard medical protocols of the era. He was convinced that her case represented a unique opportunity to significantly advance medical understanding of the nature of the human mind and its potential capabilities. The experiments included extensive tests of memory, linguistic capacity, general knowledge, and cognitive abilities. Catherine was subjected to evaluations normally applied only to highly educated adults, including complex logic tests, philosophical analysis, and detailed tests of historical knowledge. In all of these tests, she demonstrated capabilities far beyond what should have been possible for a child of her age and educational background. Dr. Hartwell also conducted experiments to try to understand the source of Catherine's impossible knowledge. He presented her with photographs of people she could never have known, obscure historical documents, and even texts in dead languages. In each case, Catherine demonstrated surprising familiarity with the presented material, providing specific details she couldn't have possibly learned through conventional means. A particularly revealing experiment involved presenting Catherine with a photograph of an unknown man who had died 10 years earlier in a distant city. Without any contextual information, she was able to provide the man's full name, details about his family, the specific cause of his death, and even information about his personal habits and personality. When Hartwell subsequently investigated, he discovered that all the information provided by Catherine was completely accurate. During these experiments, Catherine also began demonstrating what Hartwell described as premonitory capabilities. She made specific predictions about future events that invariably came true with disturbing accuracy. She predicted the deaths of 3 specific patients in the hospital, mentioning not only when they would die, but also the exact circumstances of their deaths. In all cases, her predictions proved completely accurate, although Catherine's mental and supernatural capabilities seemed to be intensifying over time. Her physical condition began deteriorating worryingly during the winter of 1870 to 1871. The deterioration didn't follow recognizable medical patterns and seemed connected somehow to the anomalous manifestations she demonstrated. Catherine began losing weight dramatically, despite maintaining an apparently normal appetite. Her skin became pale and almost translucent, with bluish veins becoming clearly visible through the epidermis. Her hair began darkening and becoming thicker, assuming an almost abnormal quality that resembled animal fur more than human hair. More disturbingly, Catherine began demonstrating periods of complete physical rigidity that lasted for several hours. During these episodes, she remained completely motionless, like a statue, without responding to any external stimuli. Her breathing and heartbeat continued normally, but she didn't blink, move, or respond when spoken to. Dr. Hartwell discovered that these periods of rigidity coincided with the most intense supernatural manifestations. During these moments, the room temperature dropped drastically. Objects moved more frequently and intensely, and several members of the medical staff reported strange physical sensations, dizziness, nausea, and the disturbing feeling that something invisible was present in the room. Catherine also began speaking during these periods of rigidity, but her voice assumed qualities that were clearly different from her normal speech. Sometimes she spoke with multiple voices simultaneously, creating an impossible harmonic effect that made listeners feel dizzy. Other times, her voice assumed timbres and intonations that were clearly adult, as if other personalities were speaking through her. During these episodes, Catherine revealed even more specific and impossible information about people and events. She described in precise detail historical events that had occurred centuries before her birth, spoke about people who had died decades ago as if she knew them personally, and even made predictions about future events that invariably came true. Catherine's predictions became particularly accurate and disturbing during this period. She predicted the specific deaths of important politicians, natural disasters with exact dates and locations, and even personal events in the lives of the medical staff members. All of her predictions came true exactly as she had described. In May of 1871, after more than a year of studying Catherine, Dr. Hartwell made a decision that would forever change our understanding of her case. He decided to photograph her as part of his medical documentation. The decision wasn't taken lightly. Hartwell had noticed that Catherine seemed literally different to different people, depending on who observed her and when. Some members of the medical staff described her as an apparently normal girl, perhaps a little pale and thin, but physically unremarkable. Others saw something deeply disturbing in her appearance, an indefinable quality that left them deeply uncomfortable and anxious. Hartwell himself had experienced this perceptual variability. On some occasions, Catherine seemed exactly what she was, a 9-year-old girl, albeit exceptionally intelligent and disturbed. On other occasions, especially during her periods of rigidity or when she demonstrated her most extraordinary capabilities, there was something in her appearance that made him feel as if he were looking at something much older and more powerful than a human child. Hartwell hoped that a photograph could objectively capture Catherine's real appearance, providing consistent visual evidence that could be studied, analyzed, and compared over time. He also hoped that the photograph might reveal details about her condition that weren't obvious during direct observation. Medical photography was a relatively new practice at the time, but it was becoming an important tool for documenting psychiatric cases. Several pioneering hospitals were using photography to create visual records of patients, both for identification purposes and for studying correlations between physical appearance and mental conditions. Dr. Hartwell contacted James Thornton, a photographer specializing in medical portraits who had worked with several psychiatric institutions in the Boston area. Thornton was known for his professional discretion, his precise technique, and his experience dealing with patients in various mental and physical states. When Hartwell explained the nature of the case to Thornton, the photographer initially showed scientific interest in the challenge. He had photographed hundreds of psychiatric patients throughout his career and was accustomed to unusual situations. Thornton agreed to conduct the photographic session under controlled conditions, using specific equipment that would allow him to capture fine details and nuances in the subject's appearance. The photography session was scheduled for the morning of June 15th, 1871, exactly 15 months after Catherine's arrival at the hospital. Dr. Hartwell chose a Thursday morning because he had observed that Catherine was generally calmer and more cooperative during the early hours of the day. James Thornton arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock a.m., bringing his heavy photographic equipment, a large format camera, a sturdy tripod, glass plates for image capture, and all the chemical apparatus necessary to process the photographs on site. He had photographed many psychiatric patients before and was prepared for the usual challenges: agitation, lack of cooperation, or unpredictable behavior. When Thornton was taken to Catherine's room, however, he immediately noticed something different about this session. The quality of light in the room seemed strange, even considering the window's orientation and the time of day. There was a kind of subtle penumbra that seemed to concentrate around Catherine, as if the natural light was somehow being absorbed or distorted in her presence. Catherine was sitting in her usual chair, wearing a simple gray cotton dress that was the standard uniform for female patients at the hospital. She watched Thornton set up his equipment with obvious interest, but without the typical curiosity of a child. Instead, She seemed to be evaluating both the photographer and his instruments with an understanding that suggested prior familiarity with the process. Throughout the preparation period, which lasted approximately 30 minutes, Catherine remained completely motionless and silent. Thornton noted that she seemed to know exactly where to look and how to position herself before he even gave her instructions, as if she intuitively understood the technical requirements of photography. When Thornton was finally ready to take the photograph, he made final adjustments to his camera and instructed Catherine to look directly at the lens. It was at this moment that something extraordinary happened, something Thornton would later describe as the most disturbing experience of my entire professional career. The exact moment Catherine directed her gaze toward the camera, Thornton felt an intense physical sensation, as if something invisible had passed through him. The room temperature dropped drastically and instantly, making him shiver involuntarily. More strangely, he had the clear sensation that he wasn't just photographing Catherine, but something much larger and more complex that was somehow connected to her or working through her. Thornton activated his camera's shutter, exposing the glass plate for approximately 15 seconds, the time needed to capture a clear image with the technology of the era. During those 15 seconds, he maintained eye contact with Catherine and experienced what he later described as the sensation of being photographed by her while simultaneously photographing her. Immediately after the exposure, Thornton processed the photographic plate using the improvised laboratory he had established in an adjacent room. The photographic development process at the time required the careful manipulation of dangerous chemicals and precise timing. But Thornton was experienced and confident in his technique. However, from the moment he began processing the glass plate, he knew something was abnormal. The chemicals reacted strangely, producing patterns and textures he had never seen before in decades of photographic work. The image seemed to emerge on the plate irregularly, with some areas developing very quickly while others remained stubbornly dark. When the photograph was finally completely developed, both Thornton and Dr. Hartwell fell silent for several minutes, trying to process what they were seeing. The image that emerged from the photographic plate was simultaneously exactly what they expected and completely different from anything they could have anticipated. Catherine appeared in the photograph, seated in the exact position where she had been during the session, wearing the same clothes in the same room. All the basic physical details were present and correct, but there was something in the image that was deeply disturbing, something that defied rational explanation. Catherine's eyes in the photograph seemed to be looking directly at whoever was observing the image, regardless of the viewing angle. More strangely, they seemed to have an impossible depth, as if the photograph had captured not just the surface of her eyes, but infinite layers behind them. Observers reported the sensation that they could fall into those eyes if they looked at them for too long. Catherine's expression in the photograph was also disconcerting. It wasn't exactly the expression she had maintained during the session, nor was it completely different. It was as if the camera had captured an expression that was slightly out of phase with reality, revealing something that was present but normally invisible. More disturbingly, as Thornton and Hartwell examined the photograph more closely, they began noticing details that shouldn't have been present. There were shadows in the image that didn't correspond to the actual room lighting during the session. Vague and indistinct shapes seemed to move at the edges of the photograph, as if other presences had been captured in the image along with Catherine. Catherine's photograph quickly became an object of intense fascination and debate among the medical staff at Danvers State Hospital. Dr. Hartwell convened a special meeting with all of the institution's senior physicians to examine the image and discuss its implications for the case. Dr. William Foster, the hospital's second most experienced physician, initially suggested that the anomalies in the photograph were the result of technical defects in the equipment or the development process. He argued that the unusual lighting conditions in Catherine's room, combined with possible problems in the photographic chemicals, could have created visual distortions that gave the image its disturbing quality. However, this theory was quickly discarded when James Thornton returned to the hospital to take control photographs using the same equipment, the same chemicals, and even the same room. The control images came out perfectly normal without any of the anomalies present in Catherine's photograph. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few female doctors working in psychiatry at the time, proposed a more radical theory. She suggested that Catherine might be suffering from an extremely rare neurological condition that affected not only her mind, but also her physical interaction with the surrounding environment. Sinclair had read about European cases of patients who supposedly demonstrated telekinetic capabilities during severe psychotic episodes. This theory gained additional credibility when the medical staff systematically reviewed all of the documented phenomena associated with Catherine: object movements without physical contact, temperature fluctuations, and effects on plants and other people. Sinclair argued that an unknown neurological condition could theoretically produce anomalous bioelectric fields that would cause these effects. Dr. Hartwell, although intrigued by Sinclair's theory, maintained a healthy scientific skepticism. He proposed a series of controlled experiments to test the hypothesis that Catherine might be producing some kind of measurable physical energy. These experiments would include precise measurements of temperature, magnetic fields, and even attempts to photograph supposed energy fields using experimental techniques. The medical debate about Catherine's case intensified when copies of her photograph were sent to other specialists in Boston, New York, and even to European doctors who were at the forefront of psychiatric research. The responses were uniformly disturbing. All of the consulted specialists agreed that the image showed anomalies they had never seen before in decades of work with medical photography. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German psychiatrist famous for his studies on hysteria and dissociation, wrote a detailed letter after examining the photograph. He suggested that Catherine might be suffering from an extreme form of multiple personality disorder, where different personalities not only coexisted in her mind, but somehow affected her physical appearance in ways that the camera could detect, but the human eye could not. After the June 1871 photography session, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly in a way that surprised even Dr. Hartwell, who had observed her gradual decline during the previous months. It was as if the process of being photographed had catalyzed fundamental changes in her physical and mental condition. Catherine began spending increasingly longer periods in states of catatonic rigidity. These episodes, which previously lasted a few hours, now extended for entire days. During these periods, she remained completely motionless, not responding to any external stimulus, but clearly aware of what was happening around her. Her eyes remained open and alert, tracking movement and focusing on specific people, but she didn't speak or move voluntarily. More disturbingly, during these prolonged catatonic states, the supernatural phenomena around Catherine intensified dramatically. Her room temperature frequently dropped to levels that caused ice to form on the windows, even during the hot summer months. Objects moved with greater frequency and violence, sometimes being hurled across the room with enough force to damage walls and furniture. Members of the medical staff began reporting increasingly disturbing experiences when entering Catherine's room. Several reported hearing voices whispering in unknown languages, seeing shadowy figures moving in their peripheral vision, and experiencing intense physical sensations like severe nausea and debilitating vertigo. In August of 1871, Sister Margaret O'Connell, who had worked courageously with Catherine for months, requested a permanent transfer to another part of the hospital. In her transfer request letter, she wrote, "I can no longer in good conscience continue working near that child. Whatever is happening to her is spreading beyond her room, and I fear for all of our safety." Catherine's physical deterioration also accelerated after the photograph was taken. She lost weight drastically, reaching the point where she appeared almost skeletal. Her skin became translucent to the point where veins and tendons were clearly visible through the epidermis. Her hair darkened completely, becoming black as coal, and grew rapidly to reach an abnormal length. In September of 1871, Catherine entered her final catatonic state. She remained completely motionless for 6 consecutive weeks, not eating, not drinking, not speaking. Medically, she should have died of dehydration within days, but somehow she continued living, maintaining basic bodily functions through means that Dr. Hartwell couldn't explain. During these final weeks, Catherine remained conscious and alert, her eyes following people around the room and occasionally focusing intensely on specific points, as if she was seeing something others couldn't perceive. Sometimes her lips moved slightly, as if whispering to someone invisible. Catherine Doyle died on the morning of November 2nd, 1871, at the age of 9. Dr. Hartwell was present and reported that her death was strangely peaceful. She simply closed her eyes during one of the rare moments when the supernatural phenomena in her room had ceased and stopped breathing. At the exact moment of her death, the room temperature rose abruptly to normal levels for the first time in months. Catherine's death didn't bring an end to the mysteries associated with her case. On the contrary, it revealed even more disturbing aspects that would challenge doctors and researchers for decades to come. Catherine's autopsy, conducted by Dr. Hartwell and a colleague from Boston, revealed physical anomalies they had never seen before. Her internal organs were in perfect condition, with no signs of diseases or deterioration that would normally cause death. Her brain, when examined, showed neural development patterns that were completely atypical. Some areas were developed far beyond what would be normal for her age, while others remained in an almost embryonic state. More strangely, Catherine's body didn't decompose in the expected manner after death. Even without chemical preservation, it remained in remarkable preservation for weeks, as if the normal decomposition processes had been suspended or dramatically slowed. When Catherine was finally buried in the hospital cemetery, several strange phenomena were reported around her grave. Plants refused to grow in the earth directly over her tomb. The temperature in the area remained consistently lower than the surroundings, and cemetery visitors frequently reported uncomfortable sensations when passing near the location. Dr. Hartwell continued studying Catherine's case for the rest of his career, publishing several academic monographs on his observations. His writings became required reading in psychiatric circles, not necessarily because they offered answers, but because they documented phenomena that completely challenged the medical paradigms of the time. Catherine's photograph became one of the most studied and debated medical documents of the 19th century. Copies were sent to universities and medical institutions throughout Europe and America. Experts dedicated themselves to unraveling the visual puzzles presented by Catherine's photograph, but their attempts to explain the images. Anomalies proved unsuccessful. Theories abounded, ranging from technical flaws in the photography itself to the idea that some rare and unusual optical phenomena were at play. However, none of these theories could fully account for the photograph's powerful psychological impact, its ability to deeply affect anyone who gazed upon it. Even decades after Catherine's death, researchers persistently visited the Danvers State Hospital archives, meticulously studying her case. Dr. Hartwell's detailed medical reports became a treasure trove of information, offering extensive insights into a case that seemed to defy conventional medical classifications and understandings. In 1923, more than half a century after Catherine's passing, the renowned psychologist Carl Jung took a keen interest in her case, thoroughly examining her photograph and the associated medical records. Jung proposed a compelling idea. Catherine might have been an extreme example of what he termed synchronicity, a concept referring to events that are meaningfully connected but not causally linked. He further suggested that Catherine could have been a focal point, a place where normally distinct psychic realities converged in a visible and tangible way. Considering the advancements in modern medicine and psychological understanding, Catherine Doyle's case offers a range of fascinating interpretive possibilities that were simply not available to doctors in the 19th century. Contemporary researchers who have diligently studied her medical records have put forth various theories, each attempting to explain her perplexing symptoms within the frameworks of current scientific knowledge. One particularly prominent theory suggests that Catherine may have suffered from an extremely rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy, specifically a variation that affected the brain regions responsible for memory, language, and the perception of time. This unique condition could theoretically account for her seemingly impossible knowledge through a phenomenon known as extreme cryptomnesia, the ability to access memories that were acquired but never consciously processed. Dr. Sarah Chun, a distinguished neurobiologist at Harvard University who has dedicated significant time and effort to studying the case, has proposed that Catherine might have had a neurological condition that allowed for anomalous access to environmental information. Dr. Chun suggests that certain rare conditions can enable patients to unconsciously process subtle sensory cues, effectively creating the impression of supernatural knowledge when they are, in fact, interpreting microexpressions, odors, and other environmental signals with extraordinary precision. Another modern theory delves into the possibility of extreme savant syndrome coupled with severe dissociation. Some researchers propose that Catherine might have developed multiple, distinct personalities, each possessing access to different sets of abilities and knowledge. This theory could potentially explain her remarkable ability to speak languages she had never formally studied and demonstrate specialized knowledge in a wide range of diverse areas. However, even the most sophisticated theories struggle to completely account for the physical aspects of Catherine's case. The strange temperature fluctuations, the unexplained object movements, and the peculiar effects on photographic equipment continue to defy conventional scientific explanation and understanding. Some contemporary researchers have suggested that Catherine might have suffered from an extreme form of what we now recognize as highly sensitive person syndrome, possibly combined with bioelectric anomalies. This theory posits that certain individuals can generate anomalous electromagnetic fields that have the potential to affect electronic equipment and even alter the ambient temperature in their immediate surroundings. Catherine Doyle's case has had a lasting impact, not only on the fields of psychiatric medicine, but also on popular culture and paranormal studies. Her story has become one of the most extensively documented and debated historical medical cases, influencing generations of researchers and inspiring countless investigations into the very limits of human experience. Dr. Hartwell's meticulously detailed records have established a gold standard for the medical documentation of anomalous cases, a standard that continues to be utilized by researchers today. His scientific and methodical approach to phenomena that defy conventional explanation has profoundly influenced how modern researchers approach similar cases that push the boundaries of our understanding. More than 150 years after her death, Catherine Doyle remains an enigma, a puzzle that challenges our understanding of the limits of human experience. Her case represents a fascinating intersection between medicine, psychology, and phenomena that may simply be beyond our current capacity for full explanation. What makes Catherine's case particularly compelling is not only the extraordinary nature of her symptoms, but also the exceptionally high quality of the medical documentation that was created at the time. Dr. Hartwell and his dedicated team produced a detailed and scientifically rigorous record that enables modern researchers to examine the case using conceptual and analytical tools that were simply unavailable in the 19th century. When we look at Catherine's photograph today, we continue to see what the doctors of her time saw, an image that is simultaneously familiar and deeply unsettling. Her eyes seem to hold an intelligence and an experience that transcend her apparent age, and her expression hints at a knowledge that a 9-year-old child should not possess. Modern theories offer partial explanations for various aspects of her complex case, but no single theory can completely account for the totality of the documented phenomena. This doesn't necessarily mean that we must resort to supernatural explanations, but it does suggest that our current understanding of neurology, psychology, and even physics may still be inadequate to fully comprehend extreme cases like Catherine's. Catherine's case serves as a potent reminder that human experience can be far more complex and mysterious than our current scientific models are capable of explaining. It challenges our inherent tendency to categorize and explain everything within familiar frameworks and invites us to maintain an open mind regarding the possibilities of experiences that transcend our normal understanding of the world. Perhaps the most crucial aspect of Catherine's case is what it teaches us about the paramount importance of careful documentation and rigorous observation when studying anomalous phenomena. Dr. Hartwell and his team resisted the temptation to prematurely explain what they were observing and instead focused on meticulously documenting every aspect of the case. This unwavering approach created a valuable historical record that continues to inform and guide modern research. Catherine's photograph endures as a visual testament to one of the most extraordinary medical cases ever documented. Each time we gaze upon this image, we are confronted with fundamental questions about the very nature of reality, the boundaries of human experience, and the mysteries that still await discovery in the deepest recesses of the human mind. Catherine Doyle lived a tragically short life, passing away at the tender age of 9, but her legacy continues to challenge and inspire researchers more than a century after her death. Her story serves as a constant reminder that the world still holds profound mysteries and that some questions may be even more important than their answers. If you were captivated by Catherine Doyle's extraordinary story and desire to explore more cases like this, historical medical mysteries that defy explanation, old photographs that harbor disturbing secrets, and macabre tales that medicine attempted to decipher but never fully understood, then please consider subscribing to our channel. We have dozens of similar cases eagerly awaiting exploration. We delve into the stories of 19th century patients who demonstrated impossible capabilities, medical photographs that captured far more than they should have, and historical mysteries that remain frustratingly unanswered to this very day. Turn on those notifications so you won't miss any of these extraordinary cases hidden within the vast archives of medical history. Until our next macabre tale, farewell. This photograph dates back to 1871 and was taken at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. The girl in the picture is Catherine Doyle, a mere 9 years old. But really look at this image. Focus on her eyes. Notice the unnatural stiffness of her posture, the expression that simply does not belong on a child's face. Catherine Doyle challenged everything that Victorian-era doctors thought they knew about the human mind. Her case remains unexplainable even today, more than a century and a half later. This photograph captures one of the most unsettling and haunting medical mysteries of the 19th century. What happened to Catherine Doyle defies explanation by modern medicine and psychology, and perhaps it will never truly be understood. But the story you're about to hear goes far beyond any ordinary medical case. It's a story